And we are super happy to have her give a talk today. Arianna works at the University of Warwick in the UK, got her PhD at MIT with Claudia Goldin, Daona Tsimoglu, and Ben Olken. So she brings together everything at the intersection of economic history and political economy. And today's talk, she will speak about gender attitudes in the judiciary in the US. And we are super excited to hear your talk. Go ahead, Arianna.
Okay. So thank you very much for having me present at the Soda Labs webinar, and thanks everyone for making the time. Today I will be presenting joint work with Elliott, who's at Zurich, and Daniel Chen, who's at Toulouse, in which we try and understand how gender attitudes influence workplace outcomes for US circuit judge. So the broad motivation for this project is that women are underrepresented at the top of the legal profession. As you can see in the graphic we're showing here, women have been 45 to 50% of law students starting from the 1990s. However, they're still only 36% of the legal profession. And the closer you get to the top, the larger the gap. And in the specific setting that we're going to be studying, which are US circuit courts, in 2019, only about 26% of all sitting judges were women. So the question that we try to ask, that we ask in this project, is whether the differential treatment of female judges that is due to gender attitudes may play a role in explaining this gap. Now, the challenge to answer the research question is that traditional measures of gender attitudes, such as IITs, are not really available for this population, so for circuit judges. And this is true not only of judges, but more generally of individuals who are in these kind of high-stakes policymaking roles that we might be interested in studying, but may not be accessible to researchers. So, in this paper, we propose a novel measure of gender attitudes that exploits a unique feature of the setting, and that is the fact that for these judges, we have a large corpus of written text. And I'm going to explain exactly what text we use in a second. Then, given that we have this large amount of text, we apply recent applications that are based in the NLP literature that aim at measuring bias in language. And we generally defined gender attitudes by looking at the use of gender stereotypes in language. And I'm going to spend quite a bit of time during the talk explaining exactly how we do that. So the setting that we study, to tell you a little bit more about the paper, the setting that we study are US circuit courts. US circuit courts are the intermediate level of the US federal judicial system, and they review district court cases for errors of law. So basically, if a district court case gets appealed, it goes to a circuit court. At the circuit court level, the case gets quasi-randomly assigned to a panel of 3 judges. And once the panel makes a decision, then usually they write and publish an opinion that supports the decision taken in the case. And now opinions are very important because the legal arguments that are exposed in the opinion are exactly what set precedents within the circuit. So it's actually quite important text that is relevant for these judges. So this is, of course, the text that we are going to use. In particular, we define our measure of gender attitudes that we call gender slant to be the strength of the association of men with careers and women with families in the opinions that are authored by a given judge, which is going to be our corpus. So, given that we have this measure, what do we do with it? Well, in order to understand the role played by gender slant, we exploit in the empirical investigation two other features of the setting, and that is that we have a quasi-random assignment of judges to cases, as I just said, which means that cases that are assigned to higher and lower slanted judges are going to be comparable. But in addition to this, we also want to make sure that what we're picking up is really an effect of gender slant and not some other omitted variable that might correlate with it and with the outcome. And so we exploit also the fact that we have for these judges detailed biographical characteristics, and so we just control for them. Okay, so what do we do in the paper? So in the first part of the paper, we validate the measure of gender slant by looking at whether gender slant predicts behavior in a situation where we would expect to do so, if it's picking up gender attitudes. And in particular, we study whether gender slant influences judicial decision in gender-related cases. And these are cases about sexual harassment, gender discrimination, and reproductive rights. We find that higher slanted judges vote more conservatively in these cases. Now, having established that this measure is somehow predictive of behavior, we then turn to the main research question of the paper, in which we study how gender slant influences interactions with female judges. And the interactions that we looked at, which are reversal, opinion assignment, and citations, are relevant to the extent that they have the potential to influence the career progression of these judges. So again, they are kind of relevant, they're kind of relevant outcomes. What do we find here? Well, we find that higher slanted judges are more likely to reverse the decisions of female district judges with respect to male district judges. They are less likely to assign opinions to female judges when they are in a position to do so. And finally, they're also less likely to cite the opinions that are authored by female judges when they are the author of the majority opinion. Importantly, given that we really want to make the case that there's something that has to do with gender and not, for example, just the fact that maybe these judges are more conservative and maybe they just reverse more across the board, we also look at whether gender slant predicts interactions based on other characteristics of the judge, for example, minority status, and we don't really see anything there. Okay, before I move on, I just want to speak very briefly of how do we think that this result contribute to existing evidence. We think that we contribute to three main strands of literature. First of all, we contribute to the growing literature on how and why gender shapes labor market outcomes. In particular, we do so by studying a relevant but novel setting, which has rich data. Basically, we use this metadata that's available for these cases to infer interactions with female judge, and this is an approach that we think is quite novel. We haven't seen a lot of work that's been done on it. There's a recent paper with Battaglini that uses a similar approach, but there's not many people that are looking at the courts like a workplace. And in this sense, what we show here is that we show that attitudes might be at play even in this high stakes environment for a kind of high skilled professional, where we may think potentially that maybe attitudes or gender attitudes should play a lower role. Now, more directly, we speak to the literature on the importance of stereotypes and attitudes in decisions. We propose and implement a novel measure of gender attitudes that's based in text. And this allows us, again, to study the role played by attitudes for this high-skilled professional. And we hope that we will be able to expand and kind of apply this measure in different settings, such as Congress. Now, finally, especially in the validation part, by trying and understand how gender attitudes influence judicial decisions, we provide evidence. So we basically we really try and understand a little bit how and why biographical characteristics of judges might matter. So there's an extensive literature in law and economics that is basically that studies how specific characteristics of judges, for example, gender or ideology, influences judicial decisions. And here we really try and say, well, what are these, in a way, kind of what exactly are the attitudes that are being proxied by these other characteristics, and can we say something specific about how preferences get translated in decisions. And we think this is especially interesting because we think about it as a way of opening up the black box of judges' fixed effects design that have been widely used. So basically, all these designs just use idiosyncratic differences, idiosyncratic but consistent differences across judges in how they're making decisions. And we try and understand a little bit better if preferences of judges might play a part of explaining that. Okay, great. So before I move on, I don't see any questions. If there are any questions, just let me know, or I'll proceed.
If I may, one question. Judge fixed effects. Is it fair to assume even that people are the same type throughout their whole career? Or would we expect, in the same way that people seem their voting to move more from left to right over their life cycle, that also judges get more conservative over time or get more gender slanted over time?
Right. No, so that's a great point, and I'm going to explain kind of in the next section of why we're very constrained with this. So ideally, so kind of in a way, you could think that the companion paper to this paper would be trying to understand what are the determinants of gender slant, and for example, does it change over time within the same judge? Because that would be very interesting. So you could think of like testing exposure theories. You know, if you're exposed to women, do you change your gender slant? How does it change kind of at high frequency? So unfortunately, given the methodology that we are going to be used, we are really constrained with having only one measure of gender slant throughout the career of the judge. So it's going to be kind of an average for the judge, yeah, like throughout different periods. But definitely that is something that I agree, like it would be super interesting to explore. And I don't think there's a lot that we can do now. We could maybe do some heterogeneous effects of gender slant based on earlier and later career, but we cannot we cannot really have a time measure of gender slant. That's a little bit of a constraint that we have here.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Great. So I'm now gonna spend some time explaining the measure of gender slant. So the main technology that is powering our approach are word embeddings. Word embeddings are low-dimensional vectorial representation of language that importantly preserve semantic meaning. So we start with a corpus, then we look at the vocabulary of the corpus, which are just the words that are being used in that corpus, and then each word is represented as a vector in a 300-dimensional vector space. Now, importantly, in word embeddings, the position in the space of the vector representing the word is determined by an algorithm that tries to predict the empirical co-occurrence of words that appear within a 10-word window. So, so in a document, we are just going to be counting how many times a word appear within each other within these 10-word windows, and then we're going to try to predict that based on we're going to try to predict that, and that's going to give us our vectorial representation. Now, importantly, what this means is that the position in the space of a word is assigned based on the context that words are used in. Effectively, words that appear frequently in the same context are going to have a similar representation, so they're going to be close together in the space, and words that rarely appear in the same context are going to be far apart. So what's important to note here is that two words don't really necessarily need to appear together to be close together in the space. They just need to be used in similar sentences. So vectors, importantly, word embeddings and the vectorial representation that we got from them capture semantic relationship between words. This means two things. First of all, as I just said, it means that the distance between two vectors is informative about how similar they are, how similar the two words are. But very importantly for us, what we also have in word embeddings is that word vector differences can be used also to identify concepts. And let me just give you an intuition for this by looking at the first graph on the left. What you can see here is that the relative positioning in the space of male and female words is meaningful. And in particular, male and female words are going to be in similar relative position, which means that if we take the word vector difference between, for example, the vector representing the word man and the vector representing the word woman, we are effectively identifying a step in the masculine dimension. So if we start from a female word, think the word queen, and we apply this vector difference, so we take a step in the masculine direction, in word embeddings, we should get close to the male equivalent of the word, in this case, the word king. And if you're familiar with word embeddings, they do very well at solving analogy tasks, and this is kind of the intuition why. It's because exactly this relative position is meaningful. Okay, so having said this, more precisely, we identify cultural dimensions by taking the difference between word set, whose semantic difference corresponds to a step in the dimension. We are interested in studying gender, so we identify, first of all, a gender dimension by taking the difference between average word vectors that represent male and female words. but we are, as I said before, we are interested effectively in understanding what's the stereotypical association of this of the gender dimension. And so we also identify a stereotypical dimension in the space by taking the difference between word sets that represent career and family. Now, before I move on, I just want to say very briefly, how do we pick this word set? As you can see in this case, we have very many degrees of freedom. And in order to kind of tie our hands a little bit in the choice of word sets that we can use to identify the dimension, what we do is that we rely on external dictionaries that have been validated by linguists and psychologists of words, words that correspond to each of these concepts. Then we just take the 10 top words in frequency to identify the respective word sets. Okay, given that we have the dimension, what do we do?
Arianna,
how do we do? Yes.
Sorry, there's a question in the chat.
Okay.
Klaus?
Yes, I'm going to explain in a second.
Okay.
That's a very good question. Great. Yeah, sorry, I read the question. Yeah, I'm going to get to that in a second, but thanks. Okay, so as I said before, we have a gender dimension, we have the stereotypical dimension, and then we define gender slant to be the cosine similarity between the two. We basically just said that if the two directions in the space are very close together, you're going to have a high gender slant. Gender slant is going to be close to 1. If there's no relationship, the gender slant is going to be close to 0. And if the concepts are oppositely related, so in a way, if you tend to associate in the written language male and career, so male are more strongly associated with family than career with respect to women, then you're going to have a very low gender slant, which is -1. In general, we never see this in this case. So the idea of this is that, well, if the two concepts are very similar, then they're actually, the two concepts are actually very related in the language and in the corpus that's being representing. The idea is that we start from a female, you can think of the idea as follows. So you start from a female word, you apply kind of a transformation that should get you close to the male word. What we're saying here, if the cosine similarity is low, is that if you apply instead a transformation that should get you from family to career, you're going to be very close in the space. And so effectively, these two concepts are highly related. So to answer the question that we see in the chat, how do we use off-the-shelf word embeddings, or do we do something different? Well, we retrain. So we train word embeddings separately for each judge, and this is exactly why we think that we basically have a vectorial language representation for each judge, and this allows us to get a gender attitude or gender slant measure separately for each judge. So in particular, we consider the opinions that are authored by each judge as a separate corpus, and then we train embeddings for each judge using GLOVE. Now, as I was mentioning to Sasha before, the challenge here is that word embeddings function better when they are trained on very large corpora, and we don't have very large corpora in this setting. So we do two things to take that into account. First of all, we restrict the sample to judges that have sufficiently large corpora, and we define sufficiently large by looking at whether the gender dimension can be used to predict gender of common first names. And if this is the case, then we say, okay, the corpus, the gender dimension is picking up some information, it's not just noise, and so the corpus is sufficiently large. And what we're left with are 139 judges that have at least 1.5 billion tokens. Now, clearly, this is a restricted sample. You might be worried about whether this is also a very selected sample. And what we see is that these judges are generally comparable to other full-time judges or long observables, although they are more likely to be born after 1920. Now, the second thing that we do is that we also use a bootstrap approach that has been proposed by linguists, in which we effectively take 25 bootstrap sample of the same size as the original corpus of the judge. Then we train separate embeddings model for each of the bootstrap sample, and then effectively define our gender slant measure to be the median across the samples. And we do this in order not to have any specific document effectively skewing our measure. And this is kind of I think the state of the art to how to deal with smaller corpora with word embeddings. And as I was saying to Sasha, the reason that this this is exactly the reason why we cannot have a time varying measure using this approach. We're thinking about whether there's something that we can do to, to get around this by using slightly different approaches, but for now, this is what we have for this paper. Okay.
Can I ask you one thing on the previous slide, on the cosine measure?
Yes.
I would have thought that the middle one is where more or less career, family, and the gender dimension are orthogonal, and that the right example is one of a negative correlation. And that would again be a high gender slant, but one that associates men with family and females with career.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. So we would expect kind of a zero gender slant in the middle and kind of a minus, going to -1 in the right-hand side. So effectively, you could think of both as gender slant. We basically, let me show you just the distribution. We basically have like very few observations.
Low,
Okay, no, so effectively low is going to be kind of close to 0.
Yeah. Okay.
But this is the effective distribution that we see. Like it is a possibility that we would go in the space, but we never actually go there, at least in this application. Okay. Great.
But by training the model on each judge separately, can't there be different cosine relationships that are practically different numbers mean the same thing? So don't you have to standardize on a common corpus to have a yardstick, so to say?
Right. Yeah. So that's definitely like an approach we could have taken. So we're not doing it right now. So all the vectors are normalized. So at least there's a little bit of normalization there. There's definitely kind of separate approaches that try to, so there's definitely, there are definitely different approaches that basically do what you suggest to try and standardize, to try and basically ensure that everything is comparable. We're not doing it here. We basically kind of I think kind of our thinking was that basically we played around with a lot of training. So we do a lot of robustness check, making sure that different parameters values of different ways of like training the embeddings are not influencing our results. But that's something we could think of exactly like reshaping the measures to the extent that we do find these like consistent consistent effects on behavior. We're a little bit less worried that we are just picking up noise, because if it was just like pure noise, then we shouldn't expect it to matter in such a systemic way. But that's definitely a different approach that we could have gone with.
Thank you. There is one question in the chat.
Yes. So the question is, how did you decide the dimension of the embeddings, or was it assigned arbitrarily? So can I ask you a follow-up question on this? Do you mean, what do you mean exactly by the dimension? Do you mean why did we pick career and family specifically?
Right. Actually, I meant so every word would have a vector associated with it. And that vector would have, say, for example, 10 dimensions or 300 dimensions. Okay,
perfect. Yeah, we use, thanks for the question. So we use 300 dimensional because that's kind of the standard. We also, I think, tried with 100 dimensional, with a 100 dimensional space, and we showed that the measures that we get are very, very highly correlated.
Okay, right. Cool.
We also play around with window size similarly.
Right.
And we find that kind of this parameter don't seem to matter that much overall.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
No worries.
Great. Okay. Great. So as I was saying before, what we're showing here is just the distribution of the measure for our sample. And what you can see is that most judges display a stereotypical association in their language, but they differ in how strong the association is. And effectively, we're going to be exploiting this relative strength of the association in most of the paper. if we think about, maybe we're interested in very descriptively knowing whether different characteristics of the judge influence gender slant. And what you can see here is that female and younger judges both display lower gender slant. However, there are limited differences across other demographic characteristics. In particular, we don't really see that Democrat and Republican judges have displayed very different gender slant, which was surprising to us at first. Okay, great. So very briefly on the data, so we combine 5 main data sources for this project. First of all, we have the text data that we clearly use to construct the measure. Then we have detailed information on kind of judges' biographical characteristics. We have information on circuit court cases from Bloomberg Law, where we also get the text. For this, we have the metadata for about 380,000 cases from 1890 to 2013. Although, just for you to have a better idea of our sample, most of our sample comes after 1970 just because of volume of cases. And our results are basically robust to dropping everything before 1970. We have the year, the circuit, the topic, the judges, whether they vote, how they voted, so whether they voted to affirm and reverse, and who was the author of the majority opinion. And this is the information that we use to infer interactions with female judges. For 38% of the cases, we were able to match them to a district judge, and this is what we're going to be using for reversals. We use the text to extract the network of citations, so we know which opinions are citing which other opinions. And to look at the validation exercise, we use existing dataset with hand-coded vote direction and topic. So the constraint that we have with the second source of data is that we know how the judge voted, but we don't know whether, we don't know what affirm or reverse mean effectively in terms of the meaningful decision, because we don't know we don't know the original decision that was taken at the district court level. So here we rely on this pre-coded data set, and in particular, gender-related cases are going to be cases on reproductive rights, gender discrimination, and sexual harassment. Although we also look at non-gender-related cases later on to better understand the effect of the gender slant measure. Okay.
But there is no cases like family stuff, divorce issues. It's more highbrows.
Yes. So exactly. So these are basically what should be. So you can think of these cases of what should be considered sexual harassment. It's like, oh, where do you put the bar? Or for reproductive rights, there's like abortion cases. So this is right. So these are kind of. So exactly, so these are gender related, but they're not family court or divorce or something like that. And there's no sentencing at this level. We're thinking about whether there's something we can do at the district court level with sentencing, but we don't have it for now. Okay. Great. Okay, so the empirical strategy relies, first of all, on the quasi-random assignment of judges to cases. So this ensures effectively that there is no endogenous selection of judges with respect to the expected outcome. So cases assigned to judges with higher and lower slant are comparable, and therefore the effect of being assigned a slanted judge is well identified. Now, in order to make the case that really we're picking up something that has to do with gender slant and not some omitted variable, we also condition on the detailed observable characteristics that we have for these judges to make sure that we're really picking up that gender slant has some information that goes above and beyond that of other observables. And the design is slightly different depending on the specific outcome. Great. So I see Gabriele, you have a question?
Yes, Arianna.
Hi.
Hi. I'm trying to understand. So the measure of the slant is from the same set of cases that we are measuring the outcome from, right?
Yes, so that's a very good question. So if you can hold on, we do a couple of things to take that into account and ensure that it's not just like a Y on Y, especially in the validation exercise. So I think what your concern is just that we are training our measures on opinions that are written to to justify decisions, and then we look at the effect of the measure on the decision themselves. So there's a little bit of circularity there. So we find that if we train, our embeddings dropping all gender-related cases, we still find kind of the same effect, which is kind of which is reassuring that we are not just like picking up this circularity. And also in general, kind of gender-related cases are very few with respect to the overall kind of number of cases that we train these opinions on.
Okay, so it's not the
that's kind
same
of what we do.
effect.
I mean, so it is, but we do robustness checks that where they are not. Yeah, but yeah, thanks. Great. Okay. So, right, so the first thing that we do with this gender slant measure is to look at the effect on decisions in gender-related cases. This is our baseline specification. So we regress an indicator variable equal to 1 if the judge voted conservatively in case high, which was decided in circuit C in year T. We regress this on the gender slant of the judge. We condition on the detailed demographic characteristics of the judge, and then we include circuit year fixed effect that ensure that we are only using variation where we have quasi-random assignment. Standard errors are clustered at the judge level. And before I move on, kind of starting from now for the rest of the talk, the gender slant measure is now standardized. So effectively, you can think of all the coefficients as being the effect of a one higher standard deviation in the gender slant measure. Okay, so this is what we find. We find that judges that have a one standard deviation higher slant are 4.1 percentage point more likely to vote conservatively in gender-related cases. The magnitude of the effect is about 7% of the baseline mean, but to keep it more in perspective, it's also helpful to compare the magnitude of, to compare the coefficient to the effect of being appointed by a Democrat president, which has been shown to be kind of highly predictive of decision in this kind of ideologically divisive case. And you can see it's about, the effect is about 1/3. So there's a couple of concerns that you might have here. So first of all, it's important to note that we have conditional quasi-random assignment. We don't have quasi-random assignment unconditionally. And so even if we have quasi-random assignment by circuit and year, it is possible that judges that serve in very different circuits or in very different years might be exposed to different cases. And so you might be worried that what we're picking up is just this exposure. So gender slant is just measuring the facts of the cases, and they maybe are very different for different judges. We do a couple of things to ensure that that is not all that we're picking up. So in column 2, we control for the year of appointment of the judge, and we find that the results really don't change. Maybe a little bit more kind of more conservatively in column 3, what we do is that we include these quote unquote exposure fixed effect that are dummy variables equal to 1 if the judge served in a given 25-year interval in a given circuit. And again, we find that once we include these exposure fixed effects, we don't see much of a change in the effect. Now in column 4, we do what I was just telling to Gabriele. So we retrain our, exactly because of this concern of, maybe we are just picking up this circularity. So what we do is that we retrain word embeddings, excluding all gender-related cases, and we find a very, very similar effect here. Okay. Great. So now moving on to the main results of the paper, we look, as I said before, we look at three main types of interaction with female judges. We look at reversals of district court decision. We look at opinion assignment, and we look at citations. For reversal, we use a difference in difference design, which compares appealed cases that were originally decided by female and male district judges that are then assigned at the circuit court level, to judges with different slant. The identification assumption here is that these kind of cases that were originally decided by a male district judge are a good control group. And effectively what this means is that appealed cases can be different in levels as long as they are not different along dimensions that interact with slant. and that ensures that our effect is going to be well identified. Now, given that cases that are assigned to male and female judges, given that cases that are assigned at the circuit court level to judges that have higher and lower slant are comparable, this is at least kind of it's at least a little bit reassuring in terms of the selection that we might be worried about here. And as I said before, this is potentially career relevant. I think this is the most obvious career relevant outcome that we're going to be looking at, because we can show kind of correlationally that at the district court level, kind of the share of reversal correlates with the probability of being elevated to, so negatively correlates to the probability of being elevated to a circuit court. Okay.
So one of your bullet points there is that you do check which cases are appealed. Do you? Like, I would be particularly annoyed as a woman if I lose a case by a judge I perceive as strongly gender slanted, right? Mm-hmm. I would be more likely to appeal. Whereas if he rules in my favor, I'm all satisfied.
Yeah, so basically we are only looking at cases that get appealed, because we are looking at the cases that do arrive at the circuit court level. We don't, so unfortunately linking, so as it turns out, I wasn't expecting this, but linking circuit and district cases is not that obvious. And so we know, so the cases for which we know the identity of the district court judge, we know it from the text of the case. So there's like a history section where we are able to extract the name of the district judge, but we are still but we still don't have a perfect link, so we cannot really. So yeah, there are two separate data sets, so we don't know much about the case at the district court level. We just look at cases that arrive at the circuit court, so they've all been appealed, and then we compare the ones that were originally decided by male and female district judge. Now, yeah, the reason why kind of this appeal process is relevant is because if we didn't have appeals, so if we have quasi-random assignment also at the district court level. So overall, at the district court level, cases that are assigned to male and female judges are very similar. But then, given that if you think that the appeal process might be biased for whatever reason, maybe cases that are decided by female district judges are appealed more than potentially, or that they might be just appealed for different reasons, so they might be different. So that's why we really want to allow for these level differences in the type of cases.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Okay, so this is our baseline specification for the reversal analysis. We regress an indicated variable equal to 1 if the judge voted in favor of reversing the decision on an indicator variable for whether the case was originally decided by a female district judge, interacted with the gender slant of the circuit court judge. Beta is our coefficient of interest. We also control for this indicator variable for whether the case was originally decided by a female district judge and other characteristics of the circuit court judge. And then we include different sets of fixed effect. So first of all, we have a district judge fixed effect that ensures that we are comparing what happens when cases that are decided by the same district judge are assigned to circuit court judges that have different levels of slant. Now, we also include circuit judge fixed effects that allows for level difference in the overall probability of reversing a case. And we include, as before, circuit year fixed effect to ensure that we're really exploiting this quasi-random assignment. In addition, standard errors are clustered at the circuit judge level. Okay. So this is what we find. We find that higher slanted judges are more likely to reverse female district judges with respect than male district judges. The magnitude of the effect is about 5 to 6% of the overall baseline mean. As before, we control for exposure in column 2 and 3. We find that the effect is basically not changed. In column 4, we include district year fixed effects that maybe like improve precision. Here it doesn't change that much the standard errors, but we find that the effect doesn't change either. And finally, in column 5, we again use this gender slant measure that excludes gender-related cases, and the results are robust to this. Before I move on, I just want to quickly discuss a couple of robustness checks. I think this one maybe is the most interesting. So as I said before, we have very many degrees of freedom in choosing our word sets, and so we try to do it in this principal way in which we identify words that are related to the concept by using external dictionary, and then we just take the top 10 words in terms of frequency that as they appear in the overall judicial corpus. Then, to make sure that really kind of our choice of the word set is not really explaining our results, we do 2 robustness exercises for all of our analysis. And we do 2 things. So what you can see in the graph on the left is that one thing that we do is that we change the overall size of the attribute and target word sets. These are just the gender and the career family word sets. So we start from taking just like the top 5 words, and then we arrive at the top 15 words. And as you can see here, the results are generally robust. If we use too few words, we don't see much going on. And it could be that maybe, this may be a little bit kind of over-rationalizing what we find, but it could be that if you have too few words, you don't have enough information to effectively, there's a little bit too much noise, and you're not really estimating the dimensions that well. Other than that, kind of overall, the results are generally robust. Maybe they're a little bit smaller the more words we include. The other thing that we do is that for the word sets that refer to career and family, we just drop 1 attribute word at a time, and this is kind of nice because it's very consistent. We never find that any of these words make a difference. So overall, our results are not, our measure is not driven by specific words, which is quite reassuring. Okay, so we do some other robustness checks that I'm not gonna bore you with. Okay, so the second outcome that we study is opinion writing assignment. As I said before, so I said many times during the talk, actually, cases are assigned to this panel of 3 judges. Generally, so the way in which opinion assignment works is that, these judges hear oral arguments, then they meet in a conference, and they see whether they can reach a unanimous decision. And in 90% of the cases, this is actually what happens. Then the most senior judge on the panel generally assigns the writing of the majority opinion to one of the other judges in the panel, or including themselves. Okay, so in order to study whether gender slant influences this process, we look at whether the gender slant of the most senior judge of the panel, who is in charge of making this decision assignment, so this opinion assignment decision, influences the probability that the decision is assigned to a female author. The specification is very similar to the one that we had for the decision. So really, the only difference is that we are effectively just looking at the most senior judge. Something that is relevant here is that we have a little bit of sample restrictions. In particular, we are restricting the sample to cases that have at least 1 female judge in order for the decision to be meaningful, and a specific author. So sometimes the decision is written per curiam, so there's not a specific author there. Of course, kind of the decision is not meaningful there either. And we also look at cases that were decided unanimously, so when there were no dissents or concurrences. And we show that this is not differential. So the sample selection is not differential based on the gender slant of the most senior judge of the panel, to kind of reassure ourselves with that. Okay, so what we find here is that higher slanted judges are less likely to assign opinions to female judges. The magnitude of the effect is about 5% of the baseline mean. controlling for the year of appointment doesn't make a difference. Including this exposure fixed effect does mean that our coefficient is a little bit smaller, but also more precise, more imprecisely estimated. And so the coefficient is no longer statistically significant, although in magnitude it's like quite similar to the rest of the the rest of the specifications. And again, kind of using this gender slant measure that excludes gender-related cases does not make a big difference here. Now, given that we
has a question, Arianna.
Ah, okay, great.
I just did I understand correctly that maybe I misunderstood that the gender slant does not correlate with unanimous voting?
Yes, yes. So the gender slant of the most senior judge of the case does not correlate with unanimous.
Okay, only of the senior one.
Yes.
It's unclear to me, but I mean, it sounds like something that you want to explore, right? Because
yeah, so
I would have guessed that given that this gender slant makes me vote very conservative, I should find, especially when there is another judge that is a man, one of the judges is a woman, I should find that I encounter more resistance. But then maybe I'm exercising a huge influence because I'm the senior judge, and maybe there's something interesting in there about this influence that the senior judge is doing. I don't know. I don't really know what my point is, but I think
no. So that's thanks. So that's actually a very good point. So a couple of things on that. We thought about looking at dissents and concurrences separately based on who's authoring the majority opinion. In the end, they're kind of all determined at the same time, so it wasn't clear exactly like how to think about it. So because you could think, I guess that the reason, what we were thinking about at first is that, well, you know, potentially if the opinion is assigned to a woman, then you're more likely to maybe like to dissent or even to concur. Both could be going on, but then kind of these are all, so it basically like it's more like the decision is taken, then kind of concurrences and kind of especially dissents are kind of divided at this stage, and then the opinion is assigned on who, based on among the judges who are not dissenting. So that's a little bit less clear. Something that has to do with the voting that I think is important is that so the cases that we were looking at first are actually kind of selected to be ideologically very divisive. So they were, so basically the way that those data sets are constructed is that kind of legal basically, you know, the scholars identify topics that are especially ideologically divisive, and then kind of the research assistant go through the history of the courts and then identify cases that are especially ideologically divisive. Something that is interesting and I'm gonna talk about in a sec is that generally we find that gender slant influences so judges that have higher gender slant tend to vote more conservatively also in non-gender related cases, but we don't find differences in cases across the board. So in ideologically divisive cases, we do see this conservativeness playing up, but these are few and selected cases. So most of the cases are not that ideologically divisive, and so that's probably why, if you're looking at overall, if you're looking at overall cases, maybe we're not seeing a lot going on there. But if we were to look at those cases, then maybe we could see something there, because there it's more contentious. Those decisions maybe are also like more important down the line. So there's something we could look at more. Thanks.
Can I also ask you one thing on the case writing? So you say it's always 3 judges. This most senior judge can also assign the write-up to herself or to himself?
Yes.
Or it's always one of the other 2?
No, it's one of the 3. And there's actually a little bit more self-assignment. We check, I think, as a robustness check, I don't think we necessarily exclude self-assignments, but we do, right, we do exclude female judges, and we see that there's still an effect with, so yeah, we exclude, So maybe we're just picking up something that has to do with female judges self-assigning to themselves, and then the male judges that have higher gender slant are just less likely to assign it to women, and that's what we're picking up. If you see in column 5, we still find this effect. It's a little bit smaller, although probably not statistically different, but we still see an effect even just by looking at male male senior judges.
And also, what I think matters a lot is how independent is the write-up. So even if Paul tells me to write up the minutes of the latest meeting, I will send it round and he can put in comments and rewrite it. So it could be that the male judge is just being nice and doesn't dump the stupid work on the female judge and does it himself.
Yes, so that's a very good point, and I think it's a great segue for kind of my next slide. So in generally, the way that we see this is that still kind of the author of the opinion still has a lot of so definitely, especially because it's a decision that is unanimous, so everybody agrees on the decision, then why should the author matter? Well, we still think that that is kind of, even just like the choice of arguments or the choice of words is like specific to the judge, so we think there is some kind of meaning there. We do think though, so the natural question that comes out next is that, is this a good or a bad thing? Because you could think that maybe you know, it's a bad quote unquote thing if you're not assigning to women kind of very important kind of the opinion writing of very relevant decisions that maybe are going to be cited for years down the line. But maybe if it's just kind of a menial task, or like if it's a simple opinion and then maybe it's just like not worth their time. So we try to do a little bit on that. Unfortunately, we're not like super successful. So let me tell you what we did. So we try to understand whether the types of opinions that are assigned to female judges by higher slanted judges with respect to lower slanted judges is different. So we did a couple of things. So here what I'm showing you is we looked across topics. And what you can see is that, yes, maybe there are a little bit kind of higher slanted judges are less likely to assign opinions about kind of economic activity to female judges, but it's very difficult to kind of come up with a clear pattern here because, you know, it's a bit tough to, so potentially it's a bit tough to rank this. So something that we try to do though directly with the importance of the decision is we try to predict forward citation of the case just based on the baseline characteristics of the case, which are, I think we just use topic and party names, and unfortunately, so we don't see a difference there. It's a little bit tough to make a statement because we don't know whether there's something off with our proxy, because maybe we don't have enough information just with the topics and the party names to really make a prediction of on how important the case is. Ideally, we would maybe like to have, so the other thing that we thought is like, well, maybe do the same exercise by using the text of the district court case, but we're still not matching them well enough to be able to do so. But yeah, so this is a little bit like we try to do something, but it's not, you know, we cannot really draw like final conclusions from this. But it's definitely like a very, very good point. So which is why kind of the reversal in a way kind of has become our kind of the first outcome that we talk about. And it's basically, because in that case, it's a little bit more obvious kind of whether, you know, what it means effectively, the reversal. With opinion assignment, it's a little bit less clear. Okay, great. So the final outcome that we look at are citations. So we look at the probability of citing a female judge, and we regress it on the gender slant of the author of the majority opinion. Now we are taking all these results with a little bit of a grain of salt, because of course the opinion, you know, the opinion assignment process is endogenous, and so it's a bit, you know, it's clear like we don't even if we include security or fixed effects, we don't really have, maybe the maybe the gender slant is not, you know, maybe it's a little bit, there's a little bit of a sample selection going on here, but we thought it was still an outcome that was interesting to study. And so what we find here is that judges with higher gender slant are less likely to cite opinions that are authored by female judges. Although the result, interesting, is really not robust to using this slant that excludes gender-related cases. Okay, before I move on, I just want to spend some time, kind of before I conclude, I just want to spend some time thinking about whether gender slant is really proxying for gender preferences. And we do a couple of things to try and understand whether this is the case. So first of all, we looked at whether gender slant explain voting in highly ideologically divisive but non-gender related cases. And what you can see here is that higher slanted judges tend to vote more conservatively also in non-gender related cases. But importantly, the effect is smaller, and so the effect is smaller, and it's not robust so it's not as robust as the one in gender-related cases. Now, in order to really test whether the effect is smaller and like whether does it survive, we also estimate the difference in different specification, in which we compare higher and lower slanted judges in gender-related cases with respect to non-gender-related cases. And what you can see here is that indeed the effect of gender slant in gender-related cases is larger than the effect of gender slant in non-gender related cases, which is kind of reassuring in that we do think, after all, yeah, we do think that maybe gender slant is also picking up some measure of conservativeness, but it's not the full story. And importantly, all of our results on the interactions with female judges are robust to including different measures, so to controlling to different measure of ideology, and in particular to controlling for the share of votes that are conservative in non-gender related cases from this data set. And the reason why we do that is because, of course, we have this proxy for ideology, which is party or nominating preference, but that's precedent, but that's admittedly a little bit of a coarse measure. And so we try to improve on this, for example, by looking at this voting. Okay. Oh, sorry, I need to go back the old way. Okay. So the other thing that we do for the part of interaction is we try and look at whether slanted judges respond differently to other judge characteristics. And in particular, we look at party of appointing president, minority status, or age. And in general, we don't find that, we find that slanted judges do not differentially respond to these characteristics. And as I said before, the results are robust to controlling for additional conservative measures. Now, the other thing that I wanted to add is that if you look at our results, it's a little bit unclear that and if we look at this like coarse measure of ideology, which is the party of nominating president, it's a little bit unclear that we should expect conservativeness to play a big role in the interaction, just because if we look at this coarse measure, it doesn't generally have a strong and consistent effect in the interactions with female judges. So I think that's also a little bit reassuring that you know, that we don't have this conservativeness really explaining our results. And we basically, our takeaway is that yes, it is true that higher slanted judges tend to be more conservative, but this does not really explain the entirety of our result. Okay, so just to conclude, as I have a couple of minutes, in this paper we develop a novel measure of gender attitudes that are based on the use of stereotypical language in writing, and we study how this impacts decisions and interactions with female judges. Now, before I conclude, I just want to talk briefly about a couple of additional things that we are thinking about. So one thing that we are thinking about is exactly what we are measuring, and we are that's kind of maybe like the biggest challenge in this case. So we're trying to think if there are ways in which we can get a measure and then compare it to existing traditional measure like IIT scores, or maybe even just like survey, I think kind of just survey attitudes. That would be interesting. We are thinking potentially of looking at other forms of slant, maybe racial sentiment. That would be something that we could study. In this setting, it doesn't work that well because we don't have great race identifiers in language, because often they are because they always use surnames, and surnames are not distinctive, and then kind of other identifiers are not really that common. So it's not working that well for judges, but we hope that we would be able to do something related in other settings. And then again, we're looking at whether this is relevant in other domains. So we're thinking about, in particular, congressional speech and potentially, as I said, district judges and sentencing. Okay. Great. So yeah, thank you everyone for your question and your time. And if you have any other comments, just send me an email, or I'll be, if you have any questions, just let me know.
That was amazing. Thank you so much,
Okay.
Arianna. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
We have some more questions from the audience right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, can I? Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, yes.
So Arianna, it's more related to thinking about how these gender attitudes come about, whether it's, I don't know, nurture versus nature type thing. I thought, so these decisions, are they sometimes made in groups of judges, or are they individuals? They are groups?
Yes, they are generally like panels of 3 judges.
So can you take, let's, for example, with female judges, given that it's time invariant, but can you just look at over their lifetime the composition of all the groups they were members on, and then see whether they are the female genders, the gender slant of the female judges is significantly correlated to the number of cases with, let's say, a male majority on the panel. So in the sense that if they are gender slant over time, and you don't observe it over time, but if you are randomly assigned, and you are randomly assigned on over your course of lifetime to more cases where you as a female are in the minority, if that effect significantly correlates your gender slant, that could be maybe a hint that what you observe is less sort of an exogenously given attitude to gender, but more a result of being exposed to, you know, macho males all the time. That's one. And the other one, sort of related, but probably more for a follow-up paper, is, I mean, of judges, we think that they should, you know, be this independent type of blindfolded people that just, you know, make decisions based on legal scripture. But I mean, there are some studies that show that they are influenced by other factors that go on the outside. And so I was wondering, I mean, that would mean more work, but if you could simply apply your method on, let's say, the LexisNexis database to look whether, what is the ongoing gender slant in the media, for example, and that might reflect, I don't know, some general population attitude. Now, of course, you have the year fixed effects that, you know, over time, hopefully, you know, changes the gender slant, but I guess even within years, you could have variations in the gender slant. And so you could then look whether, I mean, creating this measure might take some time, but if this measure is kind of correlated to the gender slant of your judges during the time they were active, that again could hint that, you know, it's not something exogenously given, but they are, you know, their gender slant is a product of society. Sorry for the long comment.
No, thanks a lot. Yeah, they're both very, very interesting comments, and definitely, yeah, the media is another setting where we could do something similar. So that's very interesting, and definitely yes. So thanks for the suggestion. Yeah, that's something we can definitely do to look at kind of just like exposure to female judges, and it's kind of interesting because there's this recent paper by Battaglini et al. In which they basically do exactly that. So they look at whether being randomly assigned to a panel with a female judge influences the probability that then you hire a female clerk, which is kind of very it's very similar in spirit to what we are doing, and so that's something that we could. So we couldn't do it. So we cannot look at slant because we have these. Exactly, we have this constraint, but potentially we could at least do some correlations with exposure over the lifetime, or kind of the different types of circuit. Something that we did do to try and look at what are the determinants is that we tried to look at whether judges that have daughters have different slant, conditioning on number of children. So you can think that gender is as good as randomly assigned, and there we do find that judges that have daughters have a lower gender slant. It's a very non-robust result, so that's why we're not highlighting it. Like, we like it, but like also it's basically like it's not, you know, if we change the number of words, like it dies. Like if we add additional control, it dies. So, you know, we're not making too much out of it, but it is very suggestive of kind of this exposure theory that we have seen kind of in different papers coming up, with like different papers on attitude. So hopefully we can do a little bit more on that.
Any more questions? David?
Hi, Arianna. Thanks. First of all, this was great. It may already be in the pipeline because the last slide kind of hinted at it, but I was wondering about like discrimination with regard to minorities. If you have like the name of the defendant or the parties in the appeal, and if you could maybe trace out if they are like more likely to be part of a minority, if there's an additional effect, if it's like a female that is part of a minority.
Yes. So yeah, no, thanks a lot for the suggestion. That's something we can definitely explore more. We're kind of just looking at gender. We're not thinking about this kind of minority or kind of interactions of gender and minorities for now. We can definitely do something more on that. Kind of the reason why we haven't really gone and looked at minorities exactly because it doesn't seem that these kind of that, you know, the methodology overall I think is kind of generally flexible, but it has to be very it has to be kind of modified for the domain, just because sometimes just like language is, you know, sometimes you can learn a lot from language. Sometimes if the identifiers are not that clear, or some of the concepts are not that well identified by language in a specific setting, we are a little bit constrained. So we don't have this very good kind of race identifiers potentially in language that we can use to apply the approach we're doing now. And if I can just add to that very briefly, this kind of, you know, this idea that we really need to look at the domain specific way of applying the methodology is also related to why we're only looking at kind of career and family. We thought about other ways in which potentially, you know, we thought about other gender stereotypes. We thought, for example, about, you know, the stereotype that women are better at arts than science, but it turns out that basically arts and science words just do not appear in the judicial corpus, so we cannot really look at that. So thanks for the suggestion. We'll definitely think a little bit more about it, but that's kind of why we're not doing it for now.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
If I may, one thing, as you mentioned, conservative liberal, that is at least in parliamentary roll call voting, the main dimension usually. But I was wondering about secular religious, because gender role models could also be religiously motivated. Whether there is a link there as opposed to the politically left-right.
Yeah. Yes. No. So yeah, I think that's a very good point. That's something we should consider a little bit more, at least give it as a, so we're kind of lumping all of this into being conservative, but it's not necessarily it's not necessarily conservative in a political sense. It could be just like conservative more so like socially, like in social views of the world, or kind of having more conservative gender norms, like exactly like it could be related to religion. So we yeah, that's definitely, yeah, that's a very good point. We should be a little bit more clear about that. We do control for religion, but there's not much variation there. I think most of the variation is like Catholic versus non-Catholic. And then we have some more religious minorities, but they're very, very few.
Yeah. Thank you very much again, Arianna. I don't see any more raised hands. So thanks so much for coming to Australia.